Hi, my name is Andrei Sachuk, and this is Google Sheets data connector for Adobe Analytics. In this video, you will get to know how to load Clickstream data to Adobe Analytics and how to work with this add-on to make it happen. So before we start, a few words about the Clickstream, what it is. So basically, I assume that you already understand what the Clickstream data is, but let me briefly explain it to you. So first, what we need to understand that when a visitor comes to our website or runs a mobile application, our implementation of Adobe Analytics captures the data. It can be page view, it can be screen view, it can be downloads, it can be purchases, whatever you want to track, whatever you already track with Adobe Analytics. And all of that is called Clickstream data. Basically, just because we click somewhere and this is being captured in Adobe Analytics. And when these events are captured, there are many different variables that you may populate, and all of that afterwards becomes a huge data set that you work with while doing analysis or reporting. So the idea behind the Clickstream functionality inside this add-on is to be able to emulate customer journey so that afterwards you can verify the segments against the data that you send to Adobe Analytics. Imagine a scenario that you prepare a complex segment and you are not sure whether the segment returns the exact data set or subtract of the data that you want the segment to return. And the easiest way to verify this is to prepare, let's say, dummy data set, and then if you really know what data has been sent, how it's been stored, then you can verify that the segment really returns what you want. So now let me briefly tell you how to create Clickstream data. The first thing we will need to do is to prepare a template. The second step is to fill in the template with the data. And finally, we will need to load this data to Adobe Analytics. For this purpose, we will be using the sidebar, and you can already see that there are a few links under Clickstream, and all of them basically help you to create Clickstream data load. So very first item is called create a template, and this is what I advise you to start with. So click create a template, and a new tab will be appended to your spreadsheet. You can see that by default the name starts with Clickstream, so that you will always have a good recognition of different workflows. And in the spreadsheet now we have a few lines. I will explain you what these lines are. And on the right, you already can see a list of possible variables that you can use in your template. So now a few words about the template. It contains three areas. The first area is the first line, which is highlighted with yellow. And this line is just friendly names of your variables, or basically dimensions and metrics that you want to send to Adobe Analytics. This line you can change the way you want. The second line is the line with the variable identifiers, or let's say internal names. This is just to let you know what variables you populate at each server call. This line shouldn't be changed at any time. Otherwise, the add-on will not work properly. So just remember, the yellow is something you can change. The gray background means that this line shouldn't be changed. So now the third area is basically the sheet, and here you can enter whatever you want based on your scenario. And you will better understand how this works just in a minute. A few words about how you can configure the template. Let's imagine that you want to add some other variables. What you can do, you can find these variables somewhere in this list, and after checking the boxes next to such variables, just click on the blue button, and these variables will be appended to the template. If you click again, nothing will be changed, just because the same variables can be used in the template more than once. So you don't need to uncheck the variables every time when you look for some new variables that you want to add. Next, what you also need to know is that you can change the order of these columns the way you want, so it's not a problem. And then what you also may want to know is that the creating a template link, which is in the main menu, is not always something you want to start with. If you want to, you can create a template from scratch with these dimensions and variables menu. So let me demonstrate it to you. So another way how you can create a template, you can do the following. First, I will just delete this template because we don't need it anymore. And what I can do, I can use this, for example, sheet, which is an empty sheet, and I can open dimensions and metrics, and now I can check what variables I want to append to this sheet. So for example, I will start with the page name, I will add events, I will add tracking code, I will uncheck evars, and for example, I will add channel. Click Add to Sheet, and now you can see that the template has been created with these variables. Afterwards, I can, for example, append some new variables, and this is basically how you can create your template. Hope this is clear. Now, let's talk about the data. The data can be sent in real time. Basically, it will be sent in real time. But the question is whether you want this data to be processed at the time it's sent, or maybe you want to send the data that is associated with the events in the past. And if so, you may want to use either date and time or timestamp variables. Let me give you a scenario that we will continue working with so that it will be easier to understand what the Clickstream data is for. So the scenario is the following. We want to create a segment that will return those who came from a certain campaign, like tracking code in our case, or we want to create a segment that will return those who came from a certain marketing channel and afterwards converted, for example, purchased something or just downloaded something or any other conversion events that you track on your site or mobile application. So now we assume that we are not sure how to create those criteria to return a certain data set. And this is why we will emulate customer journey by sending certain server calls with certain data filled. So how to do this? In my case, since I will be working with the tracking code as the main attribute, in this attribute I will provide campaign identifiers of the traffic sources. So for example, let's imagine that somebody came to the home page. This is why I will just fill in this cell with the home page value. Then the tracking code or campaign the visitor came from will be, for example, ADD-ONS. Then the events, at the moment I will not fill in. The channel I probably delete. I don't need this variable, as well as evar 3 and 4 at the moment. So AdWords. Somebody just came to the home page through AdWords campaign. Then the next page this visitor viewed on the website, for example, was the page services. And on this particular page, let's imagine that the visitor clicked on a certain element which is considered a call to action element. And in our implementation, it's tracked as event number 7. So if you're familiar with JavaScript implementation, you know that there is s.events variable, and you just populate this variable with either event, custom event, or if there are more than one events, then they should be delimited with a comma character. Let's imagine that afterwards the visitor clicked through to another page, like for example service ABC, and on this page let's say with the view of this page, we track certain micro conversion events. And for example, in our case, this is, for example, event 10 and also event 11. This is just to demonstrate you that you can separate different events, and they can be sent within a single server call. So every line is a server call or HTTP request or API request with payload. All the columns make together a data set that is sent. All right, so now let's imagine that the next time the same visitor came back to the home page again, and no campaigns were added to this. So now the question is, how we can identify that this was the same visitor? In Adobe Analytics, there are different ways how the visitor can be identified, with Experience Cloud ID, with fallback visitor ID, with visitor ID, and with backup method, which uses HTTP user agent plus IP address, and all of that is hashed. But in our case, probably the easiest way to send this data to Adobe Analytics is just to set a certain ID. I will be using fallback visitor ID. This is why I will add this variable to my template. This is also known as FID query string parameter. So I will delete these columns as I don't need them. And the question now is how to create a fallback visitor ID. Obviously, as we are emulating these server calls, we need to somehow specify value that is compatible with the backend functionality that parses fallback visitor ID. For this purpose, in this add-on, we have a certain function that you can use to properly fill in this identifier. And this function is listed here under helper functions title. And this function is called create visitor ID. So basically, this is an emulation of creation of such an ID. So what you can do, you can just type in equals and then start typing create, and you will see create visitor ID function. If you click on it, you will see a short tip how to use it. So basically, this function can be used to create either fallback visitor ID or Experience Cloud ID. I will be using fallback visitor ID. This is why I set FID as the argument of this function and hit enter. So now this value has been generated, and to be able to always see that this is something that was, let's say, originated by this add-on, the value that is returned has the following format, and only last 6 numbers are generated randomly, and hopefully this will help you to always see a unique value. So now, since this is a formula, this formula may be refreshed every time when you change something in this spreadsheet, and if this is not what you want to do, I advise you to always copy the value and then paste it as value only. So in this case, this will be a static value that you can afterwards use wherever you want. So basically, our idea is to associate all these hits or server calls with the single visitor, and this is why the visitor ID should be the same. So let me move this probably to the second column. I prefer this sequence. And now what this means that all these hits happened together, and we don't know how to separate them in time. So if now we will load this data, this data will be loaded with the timestamp at the moment that equals the moment the data is sent to Adobe Analytics. Now let's imagine that we're happy with this simulation of customer journey, and I will show you how to load the data to Adobe Analytics. And then we will continue with this scenario, and I will make it more complex. But for the moment, I think it's okay to start with this template. So before we continue, what we need to do? First, we need to probably rename the sheet so that it will be better for us I will call it Clickstream scenario 1. But obviously this depends on your preferences, just to better see what this tab is for. So then the question is, to what report suite this data should be sent to? It's a very good question, right? And we need to somehow set the value of the report suite ID. For this purpose, every time when you work with the Clickstream workflow, you need to make sure that you set the settings in your spreadsheet. So click on this settings link, and a new tab will be added. This tab should always be in your spreadsheet if you work with the Clickstream data. As you see, it contains two parts. The first part is report suite specific settings. So basically here we need to specify the server the data should be sent to. This is your collection server. And then there should be report suite ID, basically repository, and finally time zone. Why you need to specify time zone, I will tell you in a bit, but for the moment we just need to set the server and the report suite ID. Obviously this is something that you already should know, and if you are on RDC, regional data collection, then your server has a prefix, and then you need to enter .sc.omtrdc.net. Again, you should know this. So I will enter my server, and then I will add the report suite ID. For the time zone, you have some tips how they should be set. Basically, the first two numbers are hours, then 2 hours stand for minute, because the offset may be not only, for example, 5 hours, but 5 hours 30 minutes. So if you are somewhere in the US, I think this is what you may want to set. And the second part here is Clickstream global variables. And so basically the idea here is, imagine that there is a value you want to send every time with every server call. This is very similar to ADD plugins if you're familiar with the JavaScript implementation. So for example here, when you create the settings tab for the first time, this is what you will see. And what this means, for example, cookies enabled is set to N. N means that cookies are disabled. Same for Java. If Java is enabled, you should set it to Y, otherwise to N. These variables are just optionally added. You can either delete the full list of these lines, or you can just, as here in the link type and link name variables, you can just set empty values. So how this will work? We have these 4 variables populated, and these 4 variables will be added to every server call, to every line automatically while the data is being sent to Adobe Analytics. So hope you understand the purpose of it. And if you want to add some more variables to the global variable list, you can again go to the list and set those variables. So for example, just to demonstrate you, let's imagine that every time when somebody comes to, every time when the data is sent, we want to also provide, for example, server. And I will add it to this sheet. As you can see, it appeared. And here I will add my server. This is basically my site that is associated with this report suite. And in this case, s.server will be populated with this value in every server call. If you don't need it, you can either delete the value, or you can also delete the full line. The way you want, choose what you prefer. Hope you understand now what should be set for report suite and what is the global variable block. So now you are ready to go ahead, and I will switch back to this template. And how to load the data? I hope you already know that we just need to click on a certain link, which is called Load and Schedule. So let's load the data. You can see that there is a selector of sheets, and you need to find the sheet you want to load. Basically, you may have lots of different sheets in this spreadsheet, and you need to first select which one you want to go ahead with. And then there are a few settings. I will explain you just in a bit, but for the moment, let's load this data to Adobe Analytics. And what you see now is a few columns were appended, and these columns are highlighted with blue. This is used for logging all the actions that you did with this add-on. And the first, I think it's clear, show you the status, and the second one shows you when this line item was processed. And we have a failure, meaning that there was a problem. And if we go back to our settings, we will identify the problem. The tracking server is incorrect. I did it on purpose just to demonstrate you that there is such a status failure. The issues may be different, but if you see failure, then read exactly what is written here and you will understand the problem. If you go back to the settings, we will see that I made a mistake. So instead of the dot character, I entered comma character. Obviously, this server is not available. So I just need to fix it. Now it should work. And we will try again to load the data. So if I now click Load Now, you will see that nothing has changed. This works the way that if the line item got the failure status, it will not be processed next time you click on the Load Now button. So basically you need first to fix it, and in order to let the add-on know that you have changed something, you fix the problem, you need to clear the status value. So this is why I select these cells and delete the value so that it will be processed again. Now pay attention to the time of the processing, because now it will be updated and the new status will be indicated here in the left column. When the data is processed, only the template is processed. So in other words, the blue columns are not part of the template. They are used just to let you know what's happening or what happened with these lines. So now let's load. And you can see that all the lines were loaded. And you can see the process time. So basically, this is very close to the timestamp that was now associated with the data that was processed by Adobe Analytics. Everything is being sent in real time, and every line is processed at the time it comes to Adobe Analytics collection server. So this is how it works. We have considered a very simplistic scenario, but now coming back to our initial scenario is we wanted to make sure that we properly create the segment, and in order to do that we really need to have a timestamp in our data set. So in other words, what this means, we want to make sure that every certain action that was tracked with Adobe Analytics happened at the right time. So what we can do in this case, we can use either date and time variable or timestamp variable. So basically this is just a different format for the values that you want to add. I prefer to go ahead with date and time, and if I click now to add it to the template, this will be appended as a separate column. I will add it to the left. And the format for this type of column is the following. You just need to enter the date in the format of the spreadsheet. If we used timestamp instead of date and time, as you see, you can't use both in the same spreadsheet. You would need to either enter the Unix timestamp which is just a long digit, or you can also use ISO format, the way you want. So, but I prefer to use the date in the format that we usually use when we work with spreadsheets. So what I want to do, in my scenario, that visitor came to the home page, and for example, this was 18th of December, and this was 2019, and the time was 17, for example, 5 minutes and 12 seconds. In your case, this date format will correspond to the date format of your local settings. So maybe you are using US format where you have months, then day, then year. So what you really need to pay attention to is that after you entered a value, it's aligned to the right, meaning that this is recognized as the date rather than as a string. Then you can enter not only the dates with time, you can also enter just dates. This just depends on your scenario, but since I want to have this clearly time-stamped, I will use time as well. So now, next hit, for example, services happened after 30 seconds. This is why I enter here 42 seconds. So that 30 seconds is the time between the home page was loaded and services page was loaded. Now imagine that I want to emulate the customer journey the way that the visitor came to the service ABC page in 30 minutes. I want this to be the next visit of the same visitor. This is why I need to enter here the date that will be in 30 minutes after the previous hit. So this is why what I will do. I will enter here another time. What I really need to make sure is that this hit happened after at least 30 minutes. This is why now we have about 40 minutes, and obviously this page will be processed as already the next visit. And for example, in my scenario, the same visitor came back to the home page, but it already should be next day. So here I will enter 19, and for example, this was 9 a.m. All right. So this is how you can add timestamp to every server call. And obviously what we have, this is the first visit, this is the second visit, and this is the third visit. So then when we will be validating the segment, this will be also help us to make sure that the segment works properly. Either we want to return a hit or visit or the whole visitor bucket with the segment. And knowing exactly what was captured, this will help us to verify the data returned by the segment. Okay, hope this so far clear. We added timestamp, and the next action is to load this data to Adobe Analytics. So what we really need to do now is to go back to the load and schedule, and we can see that since we before loaded the data from this sheet, it's pre-selected, and what we next need to do is to load this data. Now I want to explain you the first option here, the difference between unloaded rows and all rows. Unloaded rows stands for those rows that haven't been loaded yet. So in other words, if you see the status loaded, this line will not be loaded if you load the data with the option unloaded rows. So let me click now and you will see what will happen. You see that nothing has been processed. All the line items are as were before, nothing has been changed, just because the loaded status means that these lines will be ignored. So if you want to load these line items again, we need to switch this selector to all rows. In this case, the status loaded will be ignored, like if the cell was completely empty, and if we load the data now, you will recognize that the processing date will be updated. So let's click and you will see what will happen. As you see, all the 4 lines have been loaded again, and you can see the time when these lines were loaded last time. All right. So the next thing is, what if my scenario means that the visitors were on the website in the past and I want to continue the emulation of this scenario by setting some other server calls that will happen in the future. Today is 28th of December, and let's imagine that in my scenario the same visitor came back to the website somewhere in January, and I want this to be also processed by Adobe Analytics. What I can do in this case, I can add another server call. So for example, I will just copy the first one to make this template to fill in quickly, and I will just change the page name. For example, let's imagine that at that time the visitor came to the services page. Now it was not AdWords, but it was email campaign, and there will be probably another event number 3 fired at that moment, and the date that I want to set is for example 6th of January. So you can see that the date actually, the date format was updated, and this is something that you want to avoid, because in this case it may not be processed properly. So what I will do instead, I will again copy the value as was shown in the format. Let me briefly show you again where it is. If you hover the mouse cursor over a certain variable, you will see some tips, and here you can see how the date should be set. So I will enter here that this was 6th of January 2020. Probably the time will be the same. Okay, that's all right. And now let me try to load this data, and you will see what will happen with this. So I will switch first to unloaded rows to not repeat the load of the first 4 lines. And now this 5th line, or line number 7, has the date which is in the future. Adobe Analytics can't capture the data that is in the future. So see what will happen. Okay, so now you can see that this status is referring to skipped. Skipped means that this line item was skipped or wasn't processed just because the date is in the future. What this means, if you run this process on the 6th of January after 9 a.m., this line item will be loaded. However, before it will be skipped. Or let's say again, on the 7th of January, if you click on load now, this line will be loaded. So now the question is, if you want to load this on the 6th of January, we will need to remember that we need to open this spreadsheet and load the data manually. Obviously, this is something that we may forget, or we may not want to open every spreadsheet every time to load the data. This is why what you can do, you can schedule the data load. And this is where this option starts playing. So if you go to the schedule option, now we can choose when the data will be loaded, or where this sheet will be processed. We can schedule this either on a daily basis or on hourly basis. You can choose whatever you want. For example, I can go ahead with the hourly basis, and this will mean that every hour this spreadsheet will be run by the, let's say, Google infrastructure. So this will be completely automated, like if you clicked on the Load Now button, and those line items that can be processed will be sent, and the data will be loaded to Adobe Analytics. So if you want to schedule, select how often you want to run this spreadsheet and schedule. And after that, you can see what has been already scheduled in the spreadsheet. You can see that Clickstream scenario number 1, which is the name of the tab. You can see the setting that only unloaded rows will be processed, and schedule is hourly. So every hour this will be processed. Now you can forget about this spreadsheet. Every hour it will be processed automatically, and when you open this spreadsheet, for example, on the 6th of January after 9 a.m., for example, you will run it probably at 10, you will see that that line would be already marked as loaded. All right, so if you don't want to load this spreadsheet automatically, you can always go to this menu. For example, again, I will go to load and schedule, and you can click on the delete button to delete this schedule. And this spreadsheet will not be processed anymore afterwards. We just need to wait for a little, and there we go. So now we are fine. So all the data can be filled in this way. You don't need to delete the first two columns, which are status and processed. This is a good way to let you know when something was loaded or something was failed. And just to summarize what you need to do in order to load Clickstream data. First, create a template either by going to create a template link, which will add a new sheet, or you can just add all the dimensions and metrics to any sheet you already have in your spreadsheet. So once you have prepared a list of columns, you can rename them the way you want. So for example, probably I didn't mention this in great detail, but imagine that we probably had some other variables, and we wanted to say that, for example, this stands for promo code, this stands for partner, etc., etc. So the first line tells you, let's say, the convenient name, convenient way, what this variable stands for. This is something that I recommend you to align with your dimension metrics names as you see them in Analysis Workspace. Then once you have created a template, you need to fill in this template with the data that you want to send. And I showed you how to do this with a timestamp and without. Then make sure that you set the settings. Just to remind you that the settings can be found here. This tab should be always present in your spreadsheet if you work with Clickstream data. And there you will need to specify report suite ID, time zone of the report suite, and server, collection server. And once this is set up, you can go to load and schedule and either load manually or schedule this to automate data load on a regular basis. And probably what I forgot to tell you is the time zone purpose. So the time zone you set in the settings is used to make sure that when the data is being processed, it will be properly sent to Adobe Analytics. In other words, the date that you, or timestamp that you set in this column will be compared to the time with the time zone you specified for the report suite. So this helps the add-on to work properly, to either skip the line or to process it immediately. So this is how it works. Hope you now understand how to work with the Clickstream data and you understand the value of it. You can emulate any type of customer journey with any type of variables, and then this will help you to properly validate your segments against the data that you set. This is it for this video. In the next videos I will walk you through the classifications and data sources workflows. Thank you for watching.